As Reverend Gary lights the chalice this morning, I invite you to rise, and as you are able, speak our words of affirmation, which are in your service and printed on the chat line. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To deal together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship. Please.
It was a day much like this. It was the first day of spring, Sunday, the 21st of March in 1965. 3,000 Americans gathered in Selma, Alabama, to march toward the state capitol in Montgomery. They were a cross-section of this great land. There was James Letherer of Michigan with an amputated leg who said his great regret was he couldn't do more for the freedom struggle. There was Sister Mary Leoline of Kansas City, enduring the sexually explicit taunts of the ill-mannered Southern mob. There were rabbis. There were college students. There were movie stars and moms and dads with baby carriages. And among them was a 39-year-old housewife named Viola Liuzzo, who'd taken 3 days to drive her 1963 powder blue Oldsmobile down from Detroit. They were all there to make a difference. Just 2 weeks earlier, another march had ended in mayhem as Alabama state troopers brandishing bullwhips and gas grenades had descended on peaceful protesters with a rebel yell. ABC interrupted its regular Sunday night movie to show those events on national TV, and shortly after, Martin Luther King Jr. issued an emergency appeal to ministers from all over the country to come to Selma to stand in solidarity with the victims. Hundreds responded. One of them, a Unitarian clergyman named James Reeb, was clubbed to death outside the Silver Moon Cafe. Viola attended a memorial service for Reverend Reeb at Detroit's First Unitarian Church, a congregation that she'd joined about a year before. And a few days later, complaining to her husband that there were too many people just standing around talking and not doing anything, she announced that she personally was going to Selma. Viola could empathize with the downtrodden because she was one of them. She was born in a cabin with dirt floors and no plumbing in a small Pennsylvania town where her father was a miner. He'd joined the army during the First World War, but after the war had joined the ranks of the unemployed, finally got a job for 50 cents a day in charge of the cars that carried coal in and out of the mines on mechanical tracks. One day, he noticed the mechanism giving off some strange sparks, and a supervisor told him to ignore it and go back to work. In the explosion that followed, he lost his left hand, and with no union to protect him, he'd been forced to settle with the company for a token payment of $8. Disabled with no job, he moved his family south. Viola grew up in one-room shacks in Tennessee and Georgia. She quit school at 14 to support the family when her mother had a younger daughter. At 16, she ran away and she married a man who was twice her age, a marriage that lasted just one day before she realized what a terrible mistake she'd made. But somehow this bleak upbringing just strengthened her own sense of humanity and compassion. Once, as a teenager, she did steal some money out of a cash register, but not for herself. She gave it to a young black girl whose circumstances were even harder than her own. One of Viola's close and dear friends was black, Sarah Evans. They had met in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where Viola's family had moved to get work in the war plants. Sarah was also from the South, and although interracial friendships were frowned on, were even dangerous in those days, the two women bonded. Viola had walked into a grocery store where Sarah was working. She was looking for pepper, which was strictly rationed in those years. There was something about this lady, Evans remembered. She was so open, so friendly, so lively, that against the orders of her boss, who'd been hoarding the spice, Sarah sold her some of the precious commodity. "You know," Viola said, "you're the kind of woman I like. You're not afraid to speak up. You're not afraid to stick your neck out." They were soul sisters before a feminist movement even existed. They were like family. Evans watched Viola's children while she was waitressing and attending classes. And when Vi explained why she was going down to Selma, Sarah agreed to take care of Viola's 4 young children, Sally, Tony, Tom, and Penny, till she got back. The march was a triumph. President Johnson mobilized 1,800 National Guardsmen to protect the entourage, along with an array of marshals and military police on foot and motorcycles and even in helicopters circling the marchers. The throng had grown over to 25,000, a conquering horde on the steps of the Capitol, where a defeated Governor Wallace hunkered down in his Wallace, peeping out through the window shades. As Dr. King addressed the rally in a burst of preaching unsurpassed since his famous "I Have a Dream" speech of 2 years before. How long would it take to defeat Jim Crow, he asked. Not long, because the moral arm of the universe bends towards justice. But there was still a very long road. A long road ahead for the demonstrators, a long journey to justice, and an even longer road down Alabama's State Highway 80 back to Selma, where the march had started 3 days before. Viola had dropped several of the demonstrators off at the airport. She was on her way back that night with another passenger, a young black man named Leroy Moten, when trouble started. A car full of white men drove up behind them and rammed their rear bumper. Then another vehicle that had been following closely behind started shining the high beams into Viola's rear view. Far from being intimidated, she slowed down. She let the vehicle pass. Then she turned on her own brights, singing freedom songs all the while. As they approached the big swamp lake on a lonely stretch of 2-lane road, a red and white Chevy Impala pulled even with them. The car rolled down its windows. Inside were 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan. "Okay, men," the driver yelled. "Shoot the hell out of them." Moten escaped the rain of bullets, but Viola was hit in the head and died instantly. The men who were responsible wouldn't get far because one of them, Gary Thomas Rowe, was a paid FBI informer who had been sending the Bureau reports for years about the Alabama Klan. Within 24 hours, President Johnson was able to appear on national TV and announce that the murder had been solved, that the 4 Klansmen were in custody. The problem was that the crime wasn't solved, and Gary Thomas Rowe was not in custody. He was being sheltered by his handlers. The evidence shows that Tommy Rowe was just as trigger-happy as any of his Confederates. A self-proclaimed hell-raiser, he had been recruited by the FBI precisely because of his violent temper. With an 8th-grade education and a long criminal record, Rowe had worked as a bouncer and a meat packer and a bartender who had always wanted to be a cop, mainly because he liked to shoot things, but who lacked the mental and moral fiber for police work. So becoming a confidential informant for the FBI was like a dream come true for Tommy. This was not just a regular income. It gave him a glamorous identity. He didn't think of himself as a snitch, but as a secret agent, an undercover man. It was a chance to crack heads and blow things up, all the while feeling that he was serving his country. And the FBI, of course, did little to discourage this line of thinking. They gave him a code name, blind post office box where he could mail his reports. This cloak and dagger routine made Tommy a pliant and useful but dangerous tool. Working inside the Klan, Tommy had to be just as brutal as his comrades to maintain his cover. So he beat up freedom riders with the best of them. He probably helped to plant the bomb that took the lives of 4 young children at Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. And Tommy Rowe may have killed Viola Liuzzo. We will never know for sure, because the FBI, the world's greatest detective agency, never took fingerprints off the murder weapon. Maybe an oversight. Or maybe they were afraid that their man's prints would be found on the gun. But without physical evidence, assigning guilt came down to a question of who you believed. Only the 4 men inside the car knew the truth, and they were all thugs and liars. More than a decade after the crime was committed, a grand jury indicted Gary Thomas Rowe on charges of first-degree murder, but because he'd been promised immunity, the case was thrown out. Attempts by Liuzzo's family to seek damages from the government were also frustrated by the courts, and they got very little support from Washington, just the opposite. Because her husband had been a union man with the Teamsters, J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that Viola had communist connections. Despite her Southern roots, she was portrayed as an outside agitator and a junkie and a promiscuous tramp who slept with black men. Her family believed that the FBI was deliberately trying to smear the victim to draw the attention away from their own complicity in her death. The Detroit News had enough evidence to run a headline: FBI tries to smear Mrs. Liuzzo. And the Bureau actually admitted in court that it had shredded 10,000 documents related to the murder. But in a land where official secrecy remains the norm, again, we'll probably never know the real story. What we do know is that 57 years later, the FBI is still snooping on American citizens. They're sending advanced spy planes over Black Lives Matter protests. They're dispatching terrorism task forces to surveil the Dakota Sioux encampment at Standing Rock. They're working with Border Patrol to spy on journalists who are investigating human rights abuses. They recruited a Proud Boy leader, Joseph Biggs, to infiltrate Antifa months before Biggs participated in the January 6th insurrection to overthrow the U.S. government. In fact, neither the FBI nor Homeland Security issued any threat assessments ahead of the Capitol riot, despite the red flags everywhere. Probably because they were too busy surveilling organizations like the National Islamic Society and even investigating climate activists at 350.org. In his book, The Informant, the FBI, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Murder of Viola Liuzzo, historian Gary May observes that what gives the Liuzzo case its contemporary relevance is the light it sheds on the FBI's secret informant system, which continues to this day. If America is a land of the free, it's thanks to people like Viola Liuzzo and James Reeb, whose murders in Selma helped galvanize support for the Voting Rights Act that enfranchised 20 million Black Americans. And if voting rights are again at risk, as they are in Texas, in Georgia, in Michigan, in 19 states that have passed 33 laws making it harder to cast a ballot, protecting the franchise from its enemies will not be a job for the courts or the FBI or Homeland Security or the nation's top law enforcers. It'll be a job for coal miners' daughters and for labor activists and for ordinary housewives and for people like you and me. When her friend Sarah warned Viola that she might be killed in Selma, Vi responded simply, "I want to be part of it." Not all of us should risk our lives, and Viola certainly didn't intend to sacrifice hers. But all of us are called to be part of some struggle that's larger than ourselves. Personally, I'm proud to be part of a religious tradition that includes women like her. And if there is a greater force for good in this world, some power resident in truth to overcome the lies, some moral arm to the universe that bends toward decency and justice, like her, I want to be part of it.